Hello, I'm John Rubin. Welcome to this UEP World Voice Day Marathon. Let me just set up my slides for a second. Excellent. I'm going to be talking to you over the next 15 minutes or so about occupational voice issues. I think we'll start with what's the need. My good friend and colleague, Robert Rubin, at the turn of the 21st century, titled it The Era of Communication. About 25 to 30% of the workforce, both in Europe and in the United States, require their voice for their daily activities at work. In built-up urban areas, for example, New York City, the requirement goes up to about 50%. So, from the standpoint of the voice, what's the risk? About a third of people are affected at some point or other with a voice problem. ASHA identified some years ago now that in the United States, about 7.5 million people had voice issues. And looking at school-aged children, this went up to almost a quarter, anywhere between 3 and 9% of the population. In Europe, over 60 million people have been identified as having severe communication disorders. In the United Kingdom, there's not really any reliable statistics on the incidence of voice disorders, and those that have been reported are likely underreported. So, what are direct healthcare costs? Well, a recent paper looking at these type of direct costs from voice disorders in the United States identified a cost of approximately 13.5 billion US dollars. And these costs did not include number of lost workdays. So it's quite a substantial issue. I guess the next question we need to ask ourselves is who are professional voice users? And in my opinion, the crucial requirements of a professional voice user is the need to communicate by voice for their work, that need to be desirable and a dependable vocal sound, and that it carry its own message. My colleagues at UCLH, where I work, the speech therapists, have done a risk register of individuals that they see, and they've striated into mild, moderate, and severe risks from the standpoint of voice issues. And if you look at this briefly, we'll see that in the moderate or the low moderate risk, social services, yoga teachers, journalists, some academics. In the higher moderate risk, nannies and youth workers, police officers, and doctors and nurses and other associated health professionals fit into this area. And as we get up to the higher risk and the severe risk, we start to see sales assistants, solicitors and barristers, people in public relations, individuals in the hospitality sector, clergies and rabbis, teaching assistants, the tele sales industry for sure, fitness instructors, swimming teachers, etc., extremely high risk. Both teachers in training and teachers are at the severest of high risks, as are, of course, actors, actresses, singers, etc. Let's look at teachers for a moment and voice problems. Well, in teachers, the overall risk of developing a voice problem has been identified as being anywhere between 2 and 3 times the general population. The career prevalence, depending on studies, has gone anywhere from 50 to 80%. And on the given day, there may be up to 20% with a voice problem. And teachers have been studied around the world. This rather busy slide looks at various recent countries where teachers have been studied: New Zealand, Egypt, Poland, Iran, Colombia, Italy, and India. Looks at key issues identified, which I'll talk about in a moment. But if you look at the voice problem prevalence over the career, it goes anywhere from a low of a third to a high of 80%. It's quite a substantial issue for teachers. And looking at key voice problems, obviously unfavorable working conditions are crucial. Large class size, poor acoustics, noise exposure. And then there's the whole issue, because of this, of the struggle to keep order, need to raise your voice in class. And this can lead to other issues. For example, poor sleeping patterns have been identified with voice issues. UBIOS, in a recent study in Spain, looked at risk factors from the standpoint of learning stages. And in the nursery, the key risk factor was classroom noise. In primary, it was raising the voice. In secondary, the struggle to keep order. So classroom noise is obviously an issue, and it's been looked at quite a bit in London. And not surprisingly, it's dominated by, first of all, poor acoustics and also the noise created by children, which obviously depends on classroom activity. And if you look at classroom activities, anywhere between silent reading versus group work, there's about a 20 decibel difference in sound level. But the key question that you'd ask is, does this impact upon hearing, and does it impact upon voice? From the standpoint of hearing, it does not appear to impact upon hearing either of the students or of the teachers. However, it does risk the teacher's voice. During these type of studies, teachers have been identified to raise their voice over 60% of their time, and voice symptoms correlate with things like high levels of external noise, poor acoustics, vocal load, and cognitive fatigue, both at work and at home. And that's very important. What about teaching assistants? Well, the US Department of Labor did an interesting statistic. It didn't include the voice, but it did identify teacher assistants in the top 5 local government occupations with greater than 10,000 absenteeisms per year. In fact, it found almost 70,000 days off work for this group. The question that obviously needs to be raised is, could this be voice related? I would have thought that to a high degree it is. The next area I'd like to look at is telemarketing, call centers. This is an interesting area, and in a study from 2016 in the United Kingdom, there were 6,000 call centers identified with 750,000 workers, which represented 4% of the workforce. And not surprisingly, there was an 11% association with voice disorders and fatigue at the end of a call. A quarter of people investigated said that they had vocal strain, and 10% noted voice problems impacting their ability to function. So this is obviously quite significant. So looking at it from the other end of the spectrum, what's the legislation? Well, we know that employers have substantial occupational health requirements. There are any number of directives. They're required to do workplace surveys, give information, do counseling, health examinations, risk assessments. The list goes on and on. And we know, for example, that work-related incidents of musculoskeletal problems and psychological health problems have skyrocketed. From the standpoint of voice, there are major caveats, however. And the caveats include that voice and dysphonia are not recognized routinely as indicators. For example, the World Health Organization does not itemize voice disorders as an occupationally related disorder. This is a big problem. In general, it's difficult to determine where voice disorders fit in within current criteria. OPRA, which is the Occupational Physician Reporting Activity, also doesn't include voice disorders. Now, we know that there's an ICD-10 code for nodules of the vocal cords, but nodules of the vocal cords caused by sustained work-related voice effort are only in Annex 2, and they haven't quite made it to Annex 1, which is the crucial thing for them to be included as an occupational voice disorder. So what about in practice? Well, looking at a recent solicitor's website, and occupational voice loss in the United Kingdom, what's been identified is that the potential for employees to sustain occupational voice loss has been recognized at least since 2004, when the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, included an article in their publication Hazards. And this was drawn to their attention by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. On that basis, the IIAC, the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council, did an investigation. And the outcome of their investigation in 2006 was those voice disorders resulting from occupational factors do not display unique clinical features which can be differentiated from those occurring from other factors. And that's a big problem from the standpoint of trying to identify the voice as an occupational disorder. So what this particular website notes is that although there is no specific legislation for occupational voice loss in the UK, claims can be brought under provisions that are present in a number of work regulations. The American Medical Association Guide to Permanent Impairment, in the fifth and now the most recent sixth edition, did finally differentiate legally voice from speech, which it hadn't done previously. It identified voice as a production of sound of a given quality, while speech as a shaping of sounds into intelligible speech. From a disability standpoint, a speech problem, a severe impairment, is relatively straightforward because without intelligible speech, verbal communication is so difficult. From the standpoint of voice, however, disability is much more complex to identify, as you have to look at issues relating, for example, to hoarseness, breathiness, and vocal fatigue, which is a bit vaguer from the standpoint of a court of law. Professor Sadeloff in Philadelphia has looked at voice and speech impairments related to whole person impairments, and again, depending on how important the voice is to their activities and occupation, but that hasn't quite made it over to Europe. So where does it leave us then? Well, looking at this relatively recent Department of Ed source in the United Kingdom, there are 8.2 million pupils. There are 25,000 schools in the United Kingdom, 1.3 million staff, including almost a million full-time equivalent posts. So where does it leave us? Well, in the United Kingdom, we've developed specialized voice clinics. And the British Voice Association keeps a record of this. And in the year 2000, there were 50 voice clinics that they recognized. And in the year 2020, that has doubled to 100 voice clinics, which is obviously a very good thing. And where does it leave us? Well, I'd like to leave you with our World Voice Day Marathon with verse 3 from Freddie Mercury's song, Barcelona. Let the songs begin. Let the music play. Make the voices sing. Start the celebration and cry, come alive, and shake the foundations from the skies. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy this afternoon.